Have you ever wondered what makes a person cross the line between submission and revolt? While you watch this video, an almost erased story of official books is about to be revealed. The story I'm going to tell today is one of those that make your body shiver and your mind question everything you thought you know about courage. Joseph's case is not just another episode of American history. It is a milestone that few have the courage to examine in depth. This man has left a legacy that still causes goosebumps in Savannah. If you value stories that show the dark side of our history, those that school books have never mentioned, this is the time to prepare. Each word of this narrative has been meticulously researched and will reveal details that many preferred to hide for almost 2 centuries. What you will find in the next few minutes will change your vision of what it means to resist against all odds. On the banks of the Savannah River, where majestic cotton crops were once raised, today there are only ruins covered by vines and the persistent whisper of the wind between the trees. A peculiar odor of rotting wood and damp land still impregnates the air, as if the walls of atrocities refuse to abandon their memories. It was in this same solo that in 1824, one of the most impressive stories of resistance ever told, when a man decided that there was no longer too high to pay for freedom. Joseph's story echoes to this day as a dark reminder. For those who sow cruelty, the harvest can come in a single night of reckoning. In the land where cotton grew white like snow, the blood of 11 men forever marked Savannah's soil. If you want to follow more cases like this which move with all society and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel so as not to lose any investigation. The Riverwood plantation stretched by impressive 800 acres of fertile soil, with endless cotton rows that were lost on the horizon like white waves in a green sea. The big house, an imposing 3-story structure with 12 white columns on the facade, watched its domains from the top of a small elevation. In the back of the property, 47 wooden cabins housed more than 200 slaves in deplorable conditions. Ceilings that dripped during the summer storms, walls that barely protected from the sharp cold of winter. The mill functioned as a complex and cruel organism. At the top, the Blackwood family and its overseers. Below, layers of household servants, artisans, and on the base of the pyramid, the field workers. The dawn was announced by the bell that sounded at 4:30 in the morning, dragging men, women, and children to the fields even before the sun was coming. The crackling of the whips rhythmalized the day as a perverse metronomist, marking not only the hours, but also the expectation of pain. The owner, Edward Blackwood, cultivated a particular pride in his collection of punishment instruments, especially forged chains, metal tips, and the most feared, the containing chair of his own invention, where the punished remained days unable to lie or sit completely. On new moon nights, when the darkness was almost complete, he whispered in the huts over the basement of the big house, from where the screams never ceased completely. Joseph Wright was not like the others. Tall, almost 1.90 meters, wide shoulders and hands calling for 2 decades of forced labor. He carried a dark brown eyes, a calm that was detracting from the environment around him. Born in the neighboring plantation and sold at age 15 to Riverwood, Joseph dominated a rare and valuable skill. He knew how to read and write, secretly taught by an ancient lady who had created him. Even more impressive was his knowledge of hydraulic engineering, learned for years by observing the construction of irrigation systems and improvements in the plantation. Joseph was responsible for the maintenance of all bombs and water systems of the property, ensuring access to restricted areas and some freedom of movement. On Sunday mornings, when the other slaves had their few hours of rest, he was often called to Casa Grande for urgent repairs. His position was a paradox. His competence made him too valuable to be severely punished, but he also put him in constant contact with the white lords and their visitors, witnessing their conversations and secrets. The Cabanas community trusted him. As children fidweed, it was Joseph who got borrowed drugs from Casa Grande. When messages needed to be passed between plantations, it was he who memorized the words and transmitted them perfectly. Behind his always contained expression, Joseph cataloged every atrocity, every conversation, CAD the possible weakness of the system that imprisoned it. Leave in the comments. Never give up the truth. If you believe justice must reach all the oppressed. The winter of 1823 marked the beginning of a brutal climbing in the Riverwood plantation. After losing a valuable cotton load for the rains, Edward Blackwood imposed new work quotas impossible to fulfill. 3 men who did not reach the mark were whipped to unconsciousness in front of all. A month later, 2 children who were picked stealing leftovers from the kitchen had their fingers broken with a hammer. In March, a 17-year-old was visited by Blackwood's 3 children the same night. She was found dead the next morning, her abandoned body among the shrubs as a silent warning. Joseph watched everything, his face an impassive mask that hid the inner riot. In April, Blackwood acquired 5 new slaves from a bankrupt plantation. One of them, an older man questioned an order, was hanging by the wrists for 3 days without water. Joseph was forced to install the hook on the ceiling. In May, the main overseer introduced a new punishment method: hot iron marking on his back to those who caught teaching other slaves to read. 2 women were marked. One of them had been caught with a roll where Joseph had written instructions on medicinal plants. She never revealed the origin of the paper, even when the red, hot iron touched her skin. Within Joseph, something changed, a slow and silent transformation, as erosion that eventually drops whole mountains. Hannah was Joseph's younger sister, 16 only, with an extraordinary talent for the singing and a laugh that, even in that place of despair, could tear smiles. In June 1824, during preparation for cotton harvest, Hannah was assigned to work at Casa Grande as a kitchen assistant. 3 weeks later, Joseph found his sister hidden between the shrubs near the stream, his bruise-covered body, a deep cut crossing his face from his forehead to his chin. "It was all of them, Joseph," she whispered before losing consciousness. "The Lord and his 3 children while you were in town." Hannah survived for just 2 days, her fever rising uncontrollably as the infection spread. Joseph washed his sister's body with stream water, using herbs he knew to mask the smell of death for a long time. With his own hands, he dug a deep grave under an old oak, away from the vigilant eyes. He deposited Hannah's chest a small cloth doll she had made as a child, and he had kept all these years. By covering the body with earth, no tear fell, just a dense silence, like the moonless night. In that grave, along with Hannah, Joseph buried any hesitation that could still exist. In the light of the stars, he spent his finger over the scar that marked his own chest since he was 17, a punishment for trying to escape, and made a promise: "For their silenced voice, they will pay with blood." In the Riverwood plantation, cruelty had many faces. Edward Blackwood, the 58-year-old patriarch, was a man of easy smiles for visitors and fury calculated for his slaves. His particular pleasure was to watch the punishments while savoring his imported brandy. His 3 children had learned his father's lessons well. William, the eldest, with his custom silver, handled whip. Thomas, the middle, who liked to bet how long a slave would hold without screaming, and James, the youngest, perhaps the most disturbing, who smiled while inflicting pain. There was also Robert Kendrick, the main overseer, whose boots were recognized for the distinct sound that caused instant terror, and the brothers Hewitt, Clarence, and Frederick, neighboring farmers who often visited Riverwood for fun at the expense of slaves. The 2 distant cousins of Blackwood, John and Peter Monroe, were added to them, who had moved to the property recently, bringing with them new ideas of torture learned in the West Indies. This network of wickedness was sustained by 5 other men, poor whites whose names barely mattered, but whose hands did not hesitate to distribute punishments. That summer of 1824, something irrevocably transformed the dynamics of the plantation. The arrival of Reverend Michaels, cousin of Blackwood's wife, for a long visit. On a particularly hot Sunday, while Joseph fixed a water bomb near the big house, he heard the Reverend propose to Blackwood a theological experiment. "Cousin, I have a theory about the spiritual capacity of blacks I would like to test. We would need a strong, preferably young specimen." 3 days later, Martha's son, one of the cooks, disappeared. The boy from Justy, for years it was found a week later in the forest, his body mutilated in ways that the elders of the plantation, which had witnessed decades of horrors, had never seen. Joseph was present when they found the body. It was he who held Martha when she collapsed. It was he who carried the small body back. And it was at that moment with the weight of a dead child in his arms, that Joseph knew the moment had arrived. The last humiliation came on August 1st, 1824. With the main harvest approaching, Blackwood decided to make a public demonstration of his power. In the central square of the plantation, under the merciless sun of noon, all slaves were gathered in a circle. In the center, Joseph was forced to kneel. "This black man," announced Blackwood, his visible brandy breath even at a distance. "He believes he is better than his companions to fix bombs and read a few words." The first whip blow ripped Joseph's shirt. The second left a living red line crossing his back. Today, he will learn that water and words do not save him from being what he is. In all, they were 40 whipped, each accompanied by counting aloud. Joseph did not make a sound. His knees sank into the hot earth. The sweat dripped down his face, mixing with dust. The smell of blood and earth filled his nostrils. Around, 200 pairs of eyes watched, some crying silently, some diverting their eyes, all powerless. In the quadrigeal blow, when they finally allowed him to lift, his legs trembled not in pain, but of a crystalline certainty that now occupied every inch of his being. As he staggered back to his cabin, backed by 2 companions, his gaze briefly crossed with that of old Isaiah, the plantation storyteller. The elder nodded almost imperceptibly. In that silent look, a message was transmitted and understood. The time of the stories was over. It was time to create a legend. For the next 3 weeks, Joseph executed his plan with the accuracy of a watchmaker. First, he recruited 5 trusted men: Isaiah, the old storyteller who knew every inch of the region; Benjamin, a blacksmith whose skills were required even by neighboring plantations; Samuel, a former shipwreck who had been captured and enslaved 10 years earlier; Marcus, young of 20 years with exceptional force and unshakable loyalty; and finally Jacob, who worked at Casa Grande and had access to precious information. Each was chosen not only for their skills, but for carrying deep personal scars inflicted by the Blackwood. For each man, Joseph designated specific tasks and shared only the necessary information. The plan earned a name: the Final Harvest. Benjamin secretly forged 6 special blades using diverted metal from broken tools, each perfectly balanced, with soft leather cables to hold firmly even with sweaty hands. Samuel drew detailed maps of the big house and escape routes, using coal and pieces of fabric that could be easily destroyed. Isaiah, with her prodigious memory, memorized the schedules and habits of each target. Jacob, risking his life daily, collecting information about the special program for the harvest party, an annual tradition where Blackwood gathered neighboring farmers to commemorate the beginning of the main cotton harvest. Marcus prepared strategic hiding places with escape supplies. Joseph, while his back still healed, dedicated himself to the central piece of the plain: the modification of the irrigation system and the property of the property. The date chosen was not by chance. August 23rd, when the moon would be completely new, providing the necessary darkness, and when all 11 men would be present at the harvest party. In the final days, Joseph has revised every detail dozens of times: alternative routes, emergency signs, meeting points. 3 days of execution, he brought his accomplices last in the abandoned basement of the old mill. At the sunrise of the 24th, he said, his voice calmer than ever, "Either we will be dead, or we will be the first to reap what they planted." August 23rd, 1824, dawned with an almost painful blue sky, without a single cloud to offer relief of the announcing oppressive heat. In the big house, servants ran agitated, preparing the mansion for the night celebration, created polishing the Blackwood family plot, while cooks prepared an elaborate banquet. In the slave cabins, the climate was of contained tension. The day of the harvest party meant folded work in the fields to compensate for the night of celebration of the masters. Outside the property, carriages began to arrive bringing the special guests, prosperous farmers and his wives, dressed in his best clothes, eager for the famous Blackwood hospitality. At the same time, Joseph and his 5 companions performed their calculated movements. Isaiah last checking the strategically positioned hiding places. Benjamin distributed the special blades, each wrapped in dark fabric. Samuel mentally ran the escape routes while working on the stables. Jacob, in the kitchen of Casa Grande, memorized the designated position for each guest at the dining table. Marcus, in the barn, discreetly prepared the selected horses. And Joseph, called to check a problem in the irrigation system, made the final adjustments on his hydraulic plane. At dusk, the first musical notes began to sound in the big house. Laughter echoed through the open windows, while domestic slaves served drinks in crystal glasses. In Joseph's cabin, 5 men were waiting for the combined signal, sounding away from the main supper bell, which would occur at just 9 o'clock. Every minute seemed to drag itself forever. The sweat dripped through tense faces, not just for the heat, but for the awareness of what was to come. When the sun finally put it, the perfect moonless night darkness involved the plantation as a protective cloak. The only sound that broke the silence was the distant sound of a violin playing a cheerful melody that, for the 6 men waiting in the shadows, sounded like the prelude of an execution. At 9 o'clock in point, the bell sounded announcing dinner. It was the signal. Joseph and his accomplices moved as shadows through the property. The first phase consisted of strategic infiltration. Jacob, already positioned in the house as a server, discreetly locked specific doors and unlocked others, creating the planned maze. Joseph, using his privileged access as responsible for the maintenance, entered the back and quickly reached the machine room adjacent to the kitchen. Benjamin and Samuel positioned themselves in the side exits. Marcus and Isaiah were waiting at the secondary meeting point. The second phase began at 9:25, when Joseph activated its modification in the hydraulic system. In minutes, the water pressure was reduced throughout the property. As expected, Thomas Blackwood was called to see why the garden decorative sources had stopped. In the dark corridor, Joseph expected. The blade crossed Thomas's throat before he could issue any sound. It was the first. In the main hall, 11 men celebrated, unconscious that death was already walking through the corridors of his fortress. The third phase involved systematic isolation. One by one, the targets were separated from the main group. The foreman, Robert Kendrick, was the second, attracted to the barn for a strategic noise created by Marcus. The Hewitt brothers were the next, intercepted by Benjamin and Samuel when they went out to smoke their cigars on the terrace. Monroe cousins were eliminated in the guest rooms, where they climbed to refresh themselves. Each death was silent, meticulous, almost reverent in its execution. For William Blackwood, the eldest son who had personally whipped Joseph 40 times, a special end was reserved. Tied to the same stake where punishments were applied, he had every replicated Joseph's scar on his own body before the final blow. James, his youngest son, found his end trying to escape the drainage tunnels, ironically drowned when Joseph released the floodgates he had modified. The remaining forefront were eliminated as they tried to organize a defense without ever imagining that the attack came from within. And finally, Edward Blackwood, patriarch and architect of so much suffering, was the last. Found in his office trying to reach his gun, he was confronted by Joseph. "Recognize me, sir?" Joseph asked, his calm voice as always. Blackwood did not answer, but his eyes widened in recognition. "This is for Hannah," said Joseph, before using the same knife as Blackwood himself had once used to mark a disobedient slave. When it all ended, Joseph remained in the office for exactly 3 minutes, the time his sister had begged for mercy. Then, without looking back, he left the house that had been the epicenter of so much horror for so long. In the clearing 500 meters from the main house, Joseph and his 5 companions performed a ritual that had meticulously planned. In the center, a bonfire burned with controlled intensity. One by one, they approached and cast a significant object into the flames. Isaiah threw a piece of rope used for whipping, Benjamin, an iron mold used for marking, Samuel, an owned document stolen from the office, Marcus, a broken whip, Jacob, a key to the big house. Joseph, lastly, added to the fire to the blade used to execute Blackwood, watching the metal melt slowly. Entity. At a safe distance, 23 chosen slaves were waiting, families with young children, the elderly, pregnant women, the most vulnerable, those who would certainly face brutal reprisals. While the flames consumed the symbols of his oppression, Joseph first spoke about the next step, the north journey. "We have 4 hours of advantage before someone finds out what happened," explained with the same methodical calm that had planned the execution. "We will continue in 3 groups over different routes. There was resistance. Some feared the escape was more dangerous than staying. Others hesitated to abandon family members behind. Joseph didn't force anyone. To those who decided to stay, offered precise instructions on how to deny any knowledge of what happened. To those who departed, delivered small maps designed by Samuel, showing points of meeting with contacts of the Underground Railway, the clandestine network that helped runaway slaves. When the first light of dawn began to dye the horizon, the liberated column began its movement to the north. Joseph, however, was not among them. With Isaiah, Benjamin, and Marcus, he remained to ensure that the tracks were properly erased. The last image the fugitives had was Joseph stopped on the edge of the forest, his clipped silhouette against the sky that was beginning to lighten, as erect and unshakable as it had always been, even under the whip. The news of what became known as Riverwood killing spread like fire in dry straw. Official reports described a wild upriss and brutal murders, while properly omitted the circumstances that preceded the event. Alarmed letters circulated among slave owners in 4 states, describing with exaggerated horror as ordinary blacks had managed to overcome armed and prepared gentlemen. In less than 2 months, similar cases began to be reported. In a plantation in Mississippi, 3 overseers were found dead, their bodies arranged in the same way to those of Riverwood. In North Carolina, an owner known for his cruelty was found drowned in his own irrigation system. In Virginia, 2 farmer brothers mysteriously disappeared after reports of a high black man fixing their water bombs. The authorities tried to suppress the information, but it was impossible to contain the whispers that ran from plantation planting, from cabin to cabin. The Joseph method, as it came to be called, inspired both terror among slave masters and hope among the enslaved. In Charleston, owners hired extra guards and installed reinforced locks on their doors. In Savannah, the price of slaves with technical knowledge plummeted. No one wanted to risk having another Joseph on his property. Among slaves, however, stories circulated in a low voice: how to identify potential allies, how to create effective distractions, how to modify common tools for new purposes. The impact was such that in December 1824, the governor of Georgia issued an official proclamation offering $5,000 for the capture of Joseph Wright, the biggest reward ever offered by a fugitive slave so far. The hunt for Joseph and his companions mobilized unprecedented resources. 3 militia companies, 50 professional slave hunters, and dozens of volunteers formed an army dedicated exclusively to the capture of these Savannah executioners, as the newspapers had nicknamed them. The strategy was brutal and comprehensive. Blockages on all main roads, river patrols, violent interrogations in any community suspected of sheltering fugitives. The siege was squeezed when, in February 1825, a captured slave trying to escape north revealed under torture that he found a tall man with a scar on his chest who had given him detailed instructions. The information led the authorities to concentrate searches in the swamp region between Georgia and South Carolina. For 3 weeks, each inch of the hostile terrain hit. It was Isaiah who first fell. The old man, with his leg ground, could not advance quickly enough when sniffer dogs found his hiding place. He refused to reveal any information even when his fingers broke one by one. His last words, recorded with contempt for the local sheriff, were, "The harvest barely began." Benjamin was next, surrounded by trying to divert the attention of the persecutors away from the group. He fought 7 armed men before finally being subdued. In the makeshift eventual eagerly erected right there in the forest, his last words were, "Joseph lives." Marcus managed to advance to the north, almost reaching Virginia, before being betrayed by a tavern who recognized his description. Refused to walk to the gallows, being dragged while shouting, "Others will come after us." Joseph, however, remained a ghost. Seen in many places simultaneously, always one step ahead of the pursuers. The final capture occurred on the banks of the Potomac River, when Joseph tried to help a group of 12 fugitive slaves cross to the relative security of Maryland. Surrounded by 24 armed men, Joseph Wright faced his fate with the same dignity that had characterized his entire life. He did not try to escape or beg. When the militia captain asked if he had last words before being taken for public execution in Savannah, Joseph looked straight into the man's eyes and said with his always calm voice, "You can hang me, but they cannot hang what I planted. The harvest will come, year after year, until your own land shocks them." In the following decades, the story of Joseph Wright transcended the boundaries of documented history and entered the kingdom of myth. Enslaved communities freed after the Civil War were stories about the spirit of the cotton, a tall figure that appeared on moonless nights to guide fugitives to freedom. In Georgia's rural taverns, farmers swore to have seen a high black man observing his plantations before unexplainable disasters occur. Objects associated with Joseph gained almost sacred status. A knife allegedly used by him was maintained as a relic by a family in Atlanta. A hand-drawn map attributed to Samuel was preserved by generations of a family that had escaped that fateful night. Songs emerged spontaneously in the southern black communities, with coded lyrics that celebrated the man who harvested white souls and the one who turned instruments in justice. To this day, in the region where the Riverwood plantation was, there is a peculiar tradition. On the night of August 23rd, no descendant of the old slave families dare to leave after dusk. Annually, discreet small pilgrimages happen to an old oak where, according to tradition, Joseph buried his sister. Visitors leave small objects, a tape, a miniature tool, a simple doll, in silent honor. In academic circles, Joseph Wright is often reduced to a bloody footnote, an example of irrational violence that occasionally burst into the slave system. Already in popular memory, particularly among the descendants of those who lived under slavery, Joseph is remembered differently, as the man who proved that even the most brutal systems have weaknesses, that knowledge is power, and that true freedom sometimes has the price of blood. In 2018, when archaeological excavations on the former Riverwood property revealed the remains of a complex and surprisingly advanced irrigation system for his day, an old place smiled at the young archaeologist and simply said, "Joseph always knew more than he showed." If you watched so far, it is because you care about these stories that marked our country forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so that I can meet you and know who really cares about the search for historical truth. Like this video if Joseph's story touched her heart. Share so that Joseph's memory is never forgotten. Joseph's ingenuity transcended his time. While the official story tried to erase its deeds, in the shadows of the cabins and in the dark corners of the taverns, his name was whispered with reverence. Documents discovered decades later revealed that Georgia's authorities considered their execution so dangerous that they performed it in secret, fearing that a public spectacle would transform Joseph into an even more powerful martyr. His head, kept in a jar of formaldehyde as a warning, mysteriously disappeared from the sheriff's office 3 days after his death. In neighboring plantations, something changed after Riverwood events. Owners, previously merciless, began to moderate their punishments. They looked nervously at their irrigation systems, their water bombs, any slave that demonstrated technical skills. Some even released specialized slaves, preferring to pay salaries to risk having another Joseph among them. The most lasting legacy may have been in the Underground Railroad techniques, which incorporated many of the strategies developed by Joseph and his companions. Contest-reported reports suggest that Samuel, the former shipping of the original group, managed to escape to Canada. Decades later, a man who identified himself only as Joseph's friend helped dozens of fugitive slaves cross the border. Jacob, the informant of Casa Grande, has never been captured. Some believe he took on new identity and lived as a free man in the north. Others say he continued in the south, moving between plantations, spreading silence, the Joseph method. During the American Civil War, black soldiers' units occasionally left a peculiar symbol after victorious clashes. 3 parallel lines crossed by a fourth, the same pattern that Joseph used to mark his escape maps. When emancipation finally arrived, among the former to establish schools for black children, Joseph's disciples, who emphasized technical knowledge and literacy as tools for liberation. The Riverwood plantation never recovered. After the death of the Blackwood, distant cousins inherited the property, but persistent rumors of unexplainable haunts and accidents made it impossible to keep slaves working there. The irrigation system, Joseph's technical masterpiece, continued to have flaws that no engineer could explain. The big house mysteriously caught fire in 1831, exactly 7 years after the fateful night. In the ruins, they found recorded in a beam, "The harvest continues." In 1870, former slaves of the region met secretly to raise an unofficial memorial, a simple stone structure in the clearing where Joseph and his men had performed their fire ritual. The inscription, worn out of time but still readable, said only, "He turned waters into ways and tools in freedom." In the African-American oral tradition of the 19th century, Joseph often appeared as a central figure in stories that taught resistance through knowledge. Learn your lyrics, know your numbers, understand your tools. This is Joseph's lesson, the elders said to young people. The symbolism of water, which Joseph dominated through his knowledge of hydraulic engineering, gained special meaning, representing both the way to freedom and the strength that, with patience, can bring down to the most solid structures. With each generation, the story was retold, adapted, expanded. Joseph became more than a man, became a symbol of intelligent resistance against oppression. In the early decades of the 20th century, when lynchings terrorized black communities in the South, reports of mysterious figures protected threatened families. High men who appeared in the shadows and disappeared without traces, referred to by the elders as Joseph's men. History, related artifacts continue to emerge. In 2010, an archaeological excavation recovered a blade with unique characteristics, buried in the foundations of what was the Big House of Riverwood. Metallurgical analyses confirmed their handcrafted production compatible with early 19th century Ferraria techniques. In 2019, a family of Atlanta donated to the National Museum of African American History and Culture a dated 1855 diary, written by a woman who identified herself as the daughter of one of the children who escaped the night of the final harvest. His pages contain what may be the most detailed account of Joseph, including conversations he would have had with his followers. Today, resistance movements consider the Riverwood case as one of the most sophisticated examples of planned insurgency during American slavery. The strategic use of technical knowledge, the exploitation of the system's structural vulnerabilities, the creation of communication networks, and the meticulous planning make Joseph Wright a tactic precursor that would then be theorized by modern revolutionary strategists. At American universities, heated debates continue to interpret Joseph. Was he a tragic hero forced to violence by a brutal system, or a visionary who understood that the language of the oppressor could only be answered in his own terms? What remains undeniable is the lasting impact of its actions, reverberating far beyond that night of August 1824. For communities that preserve their memory, Joseph represents something deeply important, living proof that, even in more oppressive systems, resistance finds ways, knowledge remains a weapon, and human dignity, albeit brutally attacked, can rise with devastating force. In the words attributed to Joseph himself, supposedly said at night before the Blackwood execution, "They taught us to cultivate their land, but they forgot that we also learned when it reaps." If you watch so far, it is because you care about these stories that marked our country forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so that I can meet you and know who really cares about the search for historical truth. Like this video if Joseph's story touched her heart. Share so that Joseph's memory is never forgotten.